Good evening, everyone. I'll be moderator for the second panel session, and I'll be moderating the session both in English and Turkish.
Çetin. I'm a lawyer registered in Istanbul Bar Association. I'm Secretary General of IT Law Commission of Istanbul Bar Association, and also I'm the head of AI working group of the commission. And finally, I'm a PhD candidate at Vrije Amsterdam University. And today, we are here for the event on human rights and algorithm design organized by Hrant Dink Foundation. First of all, I would like to introduce Gökhan Ahi.
Gökhan Ahi graduated from Istanbul University Faculty of Law in 1999, and since 2001 he's been working as a freelance lawyer and he's a member of Istanbul Bar Association. He has given corporate trainings on IT law, social media law, technology law, and attorney law, and he continues to teach at various universities. This is quite a humble biography, I have to say. He provided us a very humble, modest biography, but I know Mr. Gökhan Ahi for a long time. He was my professor at Bilgi University. He was also the former chair of our committee at the Bar Association. You will have 15 minutes, Professor Gökhan Ahi. Over to you. Thank you very much. I'll do my best to stick to 15 minutes. I'll try to be brief, but then I also have many notes. I would like to talk about Alan Toffler. You may know, one of the important thinkers of the 20th century, and he talks about three economic periods: agriculture, agrarian societies, industrial societies, and information societies. So these are the three social phases or waves. And information society or knowledge-based society is quite key. It is important for production, for our social construct. So it will bring a very big change, and it will transform social relations. This is the argument of the thinker back then, and we have already started experiencing that. And this will come to the fore in the future because there are great advances in IT, in artificial intelligence, and we need to discuss about its philosophical aspects, both in terms of ethics and in terms of legal perspectives. So the more we have information technologies advancing, the more we have AI or IT use becoming widespread, human rights has also come at stake, because we have seen in online platforms we have human rights, including freedom of expression, right to information, right to association, right to education, right to culture and arts. So these rights can easily be exercised through our smartphones in our pockets or through our computers. So these human rights, including freedom of expression, we can use them through these devices and platforms, but of course there are also some other factors that restrict the exercise of those rights. Towards the end of the 20th century, people thought that knowledge or information would become so widespread that people will be jumping several ladders, and there will be no one who would be left behind or who would be illiterate, and we will live happily after. But of course this is not the case, because the problems of this world not coming to an end, wars not coming to an end, and one huge problem for us is populism, and I would like to underline this in particular, because we have ever-growing populism right now. We are talking about populists who are making deliberate attempts to appeal to people and to also favor the interests of certain segments of the society while disregarding the interests of others in the society. So this is how populism manifests itself. And of course, this brings certain confrontation in politics, also polarizing the society. So this is one of the main challenges we are faced with today in our country and elsewhere. What are the problems that come with populism? Discrimination and exclusion, undermining institutions, undermining the judiciary. Today we're talking about this. We are very loud saying that we need some transparency institutions, we need checks and balances organizations. Then press freedom. Press freedom is also quite fundamental, but we can see that press has been rendered ineffective. This causes both censorship and auto-censorship. Perhaps saying it loud as auto-censorship might be a bit difficult because I can actually write articles about 10 topics, but if I'm only writing about one topic, then it means I'm actually limiting myself, and this is a form of self-censorship. And then we are also faced with propaganda and manipulation. And we all know about populist leaders across the world. Trump, who's anti-migrants, ultra-racist, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Viktor Orban in Hungary, or in India. In Turkey, we have a populist leader too. We have populist leaders too, including our president of the republic. Then we have the opposition, pro-opposition media. Likewise, Netanyahu. He's also polarizing based on reinforcing historical divisions. Now let's talk about social media. Populist leaders employ social media to polarize societies because they can use it directly for communication purposes. They can easily spread polarizing or manipulative messages. You can also sow more division among people or among different groups. Through your messages, you can instill in feelings of nationalism or enmity or animosity. Very strong sentiments. You can easily discredit intellectuals, dissidents, and you can spread same messages time and again, and this may ultimately become a motto. And of course, algorithms play a role because we're living in a world of likes, dislikes, all these interactions. This amplifies the interest in these social media platforms. And then these leaders also employ the methods of spreading disinformation about their competitors, their contenders. But we should not only put the blame on political leaders, because social media users themselves can employ the same tools. This can be used by different consumer groups. This can be some messages towards some voters, or there might be some companies for their commercial success they might manipulate. One example, one recent example, an influencer. I can't remember the name of the influencer, but if you remember that particular case, there were quite populist discourses about becoming wealthier. Look, I'm making a lot of money and if you support me on social media, I will make more money. So it was somehow manipulating people through social media. Likewise, physicians, psychologists, lawyers. I mean, you see many psychologists on social media, they pretend as if they solved all the questions of this life. And this is also tantamount to a populist behavior. But then for ordinary citizens, they might find it quite tempting to be populist as well, because they want to engage in these conversations. They want to be interacting with those conversations and further spread them. And through that way, they want to also shape other users' perceptions about themselves. But this might also work to the contrary. It might also bring some other feelings of anxiety, depression, jealousy, isolation. It might undermine relationships, family relations, or partnerships. Things might become more artificial. People might feel devoid of their values or meaning, or it might also be associated with consumerism, that one might just want to consume more and more because of the messages one is exposed to on social media. So what I'm trying to say is that this is playing into the hands of manipulation. People want to become popular themselves, and this brings a lot of problems in terms of our connection with reality. And behind all these, there are those algorithmic engineering exercises. So these are deliberate engineering attempts, and the more society is exposed to this type of algorithmic designs, the perception of society is also being shaped accordingly. Societies tend to get more angry, tend to express their anger more and more. And this might have other implications. It might create echo chambers. And in echo chambers, like-minded people come together, but on the other hand, their thoughts are only remain in these echo chambers. They're not able to reach out to others, but those who hold power in their hands, they can actually talk to anyone from any walks of life. But then we can also see sentiments being more filled. And as a result, public tend to have more impact on lawmakers or judiciary. And this also leads to this mob culture or lynch culture. I mean, if we don't like someone's opinion, we can easily lynch the person that we don't like. We target others, we finger point others, we actually show others as scapegoats. And then politicians, lawmakers, they also carry out their legislative activities with this knowledge in their minds. They know that through this they can shape public perception. And it is quite easy because we have these chatbots, these bot accounts. You can easily open this bot accounts and you can do any sort of manipulation, and this is supported by algorithms. Then there is this hashtag manipulation. Through hashtags, you can bring a certain issue to the fore, or you can do ghosting. And then there are these troll accounts used for the purpose of disinformation or containment. Then there is this gamification. We're not even aware, we don't even notice it. We just think that we're just joining into a survey or filling in a query, but actually this is gamification, because people are trying to extract information from us about our tendencies, about our likes. So we're feeding information to them without being aware of it. Then there are manipulated images, visuals. These can be AI supported. Many photos we see on the internet today, we don't know if they are genuine images, original images, or if those are AI generated images. Any image that is being used should always come with a disclaimer, but we don't see it yet. Then there might be false stories, conspiracies. This can easily spread too. And they are used deliberately to create misperception. And by the way, like all these false news, fake news, they travel the world so fast. If you want to just debunk them, it takes much more time and effort. And by the way, of course, people also do their own homework and they invent more and more effective analysis. Of course, we should also remember Cambridge Analytica. This is a striking example because it is used for data analytics and data mining. They initially presented themselves as a think tank. But then you might remember the US presidential elections in 2016 where Trump scored a victory. So then Cambridge Analytica came under discussion, likewise in Brexit referendum. But we know that the Cambridge CEO resigned. Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook CEO, he was questioned at the Congress. Some legislations were put into place. Some measures were taken. And in order to counter manipulation or fake news, now there are some attempts to counter that. But of course, it is never enough. Those social media platforms themselves, they also want to suspend accounts or freeze accounts, just prevent access to certain content. And they also claim that they do collaborate with civil society and they are transparent. But of course, it is quite difficult to fully believe in them. And then we have this concept of hate speech. We talked about populism, algorithms, social media, but then we have hate speech that very much feeds into populism and polarization. And these hate speech it can lead to exclusion practices based on the ethnicity, language, religion, or migration background of a person. And it has become so widespread. You can see it on Twitter, particularly those discriminatory practices or discourse about migrants nowadays, but every now and then against Armenians, people with disabilities, LGBTI plus individuals. And by the way, this is not only exercised by ordinary citizens, but sometimes these bot accounts do it deliberately. Hrant Dink Foundation has made a study I came across recently. They analyzed hate speech in between the two election rounds. We had recently 2 election rounds this year. And they identified some hate speech about Alavis and Armenians. There were derogatory terms to define Alavis, and then there were others about Afghanis, asylum seekers, or migrants. And they also detected hate speech against LGBTI plus individuals because they detected perverts, for instance. That was the term perverts widely used in the media that they watched. I'll try to wrap it up by the way. Yes, we need to also talk about free speech. Yes, free speech should be as comprehensive as possible, but it also has its own boundaries. If you are attacking, in a way, fundamental rights and individual security, and if it's disrupting social peace, then free speech becomes also limited. But then it's not quite easy to draw the boundaries between free speech and hate speech. As Turkey gets more exposed to populism, people want to become popular themselves. We see that more and more. And vulnerable groups, oppositional groups, they are confined to their own echo chambers. And we have some pieces of legislation, Article 215, 217. Those are actually welcome provisions, but when it comes to minorities, migrants, LGBTI plus individuals, they are not really regarded because these articles only protect people with Islamic background or Turkish background, or that they are only there to support the government or pro-government people. So this is not really all-inclusive. It is quite selective. In the context of human rights, so if we are to make a link between algorithmic designs and human rights, we know that algorithms are everywhere, all over the place, and algorithms, they need to advance further with all these technological innovations. We want them to be transparent. We want them to ensure equality, to avoid discriminatory practices, to respect privacy of individuals in data collection processes. And the data collection processes and algorithms, they should be periodically audited. There should be an accountability mechanism, and there should be a participatory approach. All segments of society or all experts from different disciplines should be joining this big discussion on algorithmic design in the context of human rights. And last but not least, international collaboration, because there are different users, different countries, different practices. We need to raise the bar in terms of standards. That's why we need to pay attention to international collaborations. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I think time is up. Yes, yes indeed.
Bir program olduğu için ayrılması gerekecek.
As Ahi has another schedule, he will have to leave, and maybe you may want to convey your questions in writing later on. And in the world of law, in the area of IT law, he is a very well-known figure, so it's not going to be difficult for you to find him. So thank you very much again.
Panelist, dear Shmaila Khan, I just want to introduce her. Shmaila Khan is a researcher and a campaigner on issues of gender, technology, and human rights with 8 years of experience. Shmaila has served as a clerk at the Supreme Court of Pakistan and as a lecturer in privacy law. She's also a lawyer. The floor is yours, and you have 15 minutes.
Oh, I've benefited from the excellent presentations that everybody has done, and I hope that there won't be too much overlap between what I'm saying. So when we talk about human rights, I think a lot of times the approach that we take to algorithms or data is sort of the conversation is dominated by examples from either the US or Europe, and that's where a lot of the legislation is being made, where that's where important conversations about regulation is happening. But there's obviously so much more to the internet and to technologies and the ways in which harms of regarding technologies manifest themselves. So I'll be focusing more on, even though it's such a wide subject, but a global South perspective and how where those rights fit in and what digital rights or human rights approaches mean for people that are outside of these Western contexts. So first of all, I'll be sort of focusing on when we talk about algorithms and AI, a lot of times we tend to foreground conversations around the technology, which is really great, like sort of these really understanding the technology, but often the data and who constitutes the data and who gets to input the data and where it comes from seems to be this kind of invisible trick that AI is doing and isn't talked about enough. And a lot of that work comes from where these important discussions around how technology is designed is coming from sort of the global north. Data and how it is fed and how it is sort of created often comes from the global south. So we see this kind of bifurcation happening. And then when we talk about discrimination, it's very important that the ways I think the other panelists have really talked about the disproportionate ways in which marginalized communities are impacted. And I'm just going to sort of reiterate that and hopefully add to that discussion. And thirdly, I'll be talking about some of sort of critically analyzing some of the legislation and some of the regulatory frameworks that have come up, and how it sort of fits into the global south and where sort of I am situated and a lot of people that and you know the majority of the world is situated. So when talking about sort of AI's invisible labor, I think it's very, very important to talk about where it comes from, because as we've talked about, data sets are what make AI sort of non-discriminatory, fair, and we keep sort of this, there's always this conversation about feeding in more data into these data sets without a proper discussion about what that really means and where that data is coming from. So for example, you know, sort of an AI, because there's so much sort of awe of AI and, you know, all these like sort of public facing AI tools have now made it even more it mystified AI even more, that it's just this incredible thing where you feed in a command and it gives you these kind of realistic, synthetic, generative images or text. But all of these large language models, all of these image generative models are made up of data, and that data often comes from somewhere, and we don't talk about that part of it. So for example, several studies and investigations have found that all of the data going into these data sets, such as labeling, such as sort of inputting, sorting that data in order to train AI, comes from very, very low paid, below minimum wage workers in the global south. And that work is tedious. It can often be it can often be, in the case of, for example, people training models for content moderation, can often be very, very dramatic. You have to deal with a lot of data that is harmful, and in order to train these kind of automated systems. And that labor is never really acknowledged or valued in the same way that the labor of those building those models. So OpenAI engineers working for OpenAI will have like amazing salaries, but people will be paid $1, $2 per hour for the work that they do. And it can often involve sitting in front of a computer for 12 hours on end, making piecemeal amounts sort of. And sort of, I think if we're going to talk about AI, we also need to talk about the invisible labor that is behind it, because we cannot have a human rights approach to AI if we don't talk about the humans that make it up. And it is often deliberately designed in a way that these kinds of like data sweatshops are located outside of the jurisdictions in which these companies are located. So for example, there's been after GPT was really praised for not being as toxic of a chat box as, you know, other previous versions, and a lot of work had gone into sort of training these data sets not to be, you know, discriminatory, racist, sexist. But that work to make it less toxic was actually coming from below minimum wage paid workers, sort of in Kenya. There are people in Argentina. We know that there are often, even within these countries, marginalized migrants who are doing this work, because it's completely outside, like people taking it up are obviously people who are not part of the formal economy or able to do full-time jobs. And that is very important, that it sort of is created this kind of global underclass that performs this content moderation, that doesn't then have a say or a seat at the table when we're talking about regulation, but is often sort of makes up what we call AI. So I think sort of talking about that labor is very important. And I think not just that, I think there's a lot of, and that's where like sort of, I think feminist approaches to labor really teach us that, you know, any grand model of things is often made up of a lot of people doing unpaid labor. And there are a lot of academics who have talked about how people who are, for example, you know, generating content on platforms are often the ones training these models in order to become better. For example, a lot of these platforms that we use are good because so many people are using them at scale. Google would not be such a good search engine if so many people were not using it. So it's our labor, our unwaged labor, that is also training these models, these algorithms, to become better. And there's no really sort of calculus of that. So Spotify has really good recommendations because it is a platform that is operating at scale, and that is something that also doesn't really figure into conversations around regulation of AI or human rights approaches of AI, because what these regulations do pretty much is that they operate within this capitalist model that already exists and accept it as this kind of framing that there will be a certain level of exploitation of data, of labor that is built into this model. And we will think the regulation will be then within this model. So it's not going to challenge these kind of foundational exploitative practices around AI. And that becomes really questionable when we talk about, you know, some of this regulation. I'm going to talk about very briefly the AI Act. It's impossible to give it justice in this small amount of time, but I just wanted to sort of foreground that, you know, if these discussions are not being talked about, it is reflective of the fact that the people in the room making these legislations and this regulation are people who are not really touched by these issues. They're not the ones who are working to at a $2 per hour rate in order to make ends meet. There are people who are operating directly with the companies and sort of operating at a very different level of economics, at a very different level of privilege. And as everybody, I think, before me has constantly sort of said, and so I won't harp upon this for very long, that AI is not neutral, nor is it always beneficial. And I think that's something that has now, at least, become the starting point for a lot of the regulation that is being proposed. So the language in the EU AI Act is about high risk AI, what that sort of means. So it is sort of conceding that certain kinds of algorithmic sort of technologies are obviously not there, and there's some applications to of AI to things like job applications, policing, sort of determining welfare, that can lead to large scale discrimination and present a high risk. So it's going to sort of accommodate it accordingly. And now we're also, as the speaker before me was also talking about, how disinformation at scale is a very big issue, and how AI can really feed into how this is generated. So I think going to sort of the third part of, and perhaps the most important, for where I'm guessing a lot of the questions after this, and guessing where the first panel ended, is about what do we do and how do we go on from here. So before all this like sort of specific legislation on AI, what we really saw was that the data protection law was doing a lot of the laws around the world, and the GDPR in particular was doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of how do we regulate, data and data justice in terms of AI. And while there is specific language around automated decision making when it comes to use of personal data, it really talks about profiling and that kind of very direct discrimination. But even that language is very vague. It doesn't really speak to the complex ways in which AI is operating, and simple consent requirements don't really address the larger issue that sort of we talk about, which is actually discrimination, which is sort of data reflecting these kind of real life harms. And it of a lot of the risk mitigation measures or sort of audits and things like that were voluntary within the GDPR scheme, which sort of set the goal template for other data protection laws across the world. And I think something to also talk about, I think something that the GDPR approach, while it says that it has a data minimization as a core principle, when we talk about fairer AI, we want to feed more data sets into it in order to make it more representative. So where does that sort of lie in? It could lead to actually further marginalization of people if we're going to minimize data, because the minimized data is much more likely to represent sort of mainstream or like sort of majority populations. So this is the kind of a risk-based approach that the AI Act has taken, and sort of I'll conclude on this as well, where there's some certain practices that are completely deemed as prohibited, which is a completely unacceptable risk. Where a lot of the work happens is regulated high-risk AI systems, where the risk is deemed to be quite high. That's where policing, that's where all of the discussions around job applications, dealing with matters of migration, that's where they lie. And I think that also sort of who gets to determine what the risk is, because the promise of the AI Act and even the DSA is that if in Europe we are able to regulate these companies, then it'll have a trickle-down effect in the rest of the world. But who gets to define these risks? And so the agenda will be again set by regulators under the EU Act, whereas the rest of the world doesn't really get to hold these companies accountable. For example, with the kind of harms that have actually occurred in, for example, a place like Myanmar, where hate speech was rampant on Meta's platforms and sort of contributed to complete dehumanization and genocide of the Rohingya people. That's not something that's going to be on top of the list when we're talking about harms. It's going to be determined by the people who were sort of regulated by the act. So I think it sort of creates this kind of creates this kind of danger where dangerous AI or harmful AI that is considered high risk or prohibited in the EU could then be funneled into the rest of the world where that is completely unregulated. And the kind of power that the rest of the countries have, I'll just take one extra minute, the almost absence of power in the rest of the world, you don't really get to hold these tech companies accountable. I've been in rooms with these tech companies where you're literally sort of pointing towards cases where you know that there are direct threats that can, get someone killed. Apart from that, I feel like people from the global south don't even bother approaching these tech companies, but they're not going to take it down, or they're not going to tweak their algorithms in order to discourage that kind of that harmful content. So I think when we talk about human rights approaches, if we do not have a calculus of actual power and where power lies and who gets to hold people accountable, if we don't have that kind of uncomfortable conversation, because while tech companies do have a lot of power, regulators also have a lot of power, and that power is not evenly distributed. And if we're going to argue for country-based sort of models where regulation is happening, then that's also something that creates a tension for authoritarian regimes where you don't want them regulating AI as well, or you don't want to advocate for that. So I think the conversation around AI regulation needs to be further complicated, and I think the people, despite the fact that it is sort of an EU-specific regime, there has to be an understanding that this will have implications for the rest of the world, and to bring those people into those conversations and have that, because we would love to also have audits of tech companies and hold them accountable. But that just sort of, I'll just end on that note that, human rights approaches like sort of can often, if they are not inclusive, if they don't have that kind of calculus of power, can be quite hollow and empty. And these tech companies are global, and that's why sort of discussions about regulation should also be truly global. So yeah, sorry if I took up 3 extra minutes.
No problem. Thank you so much. This great presentation. Everything is okay? Yeah. We are continuing with our third panelist, dear Lisa Ginsburg. I just want to introduce her. Dr. Lisa Ginsburg is a researcher fellow at the European University Institute School of Transnational Governance on the European Digital Media Observatory, and is a lecturer in international human rights at New York University, Florence. She has worked in a number of research and teaching positions, including at University College Dublin and the EUI-based Center of Media Pluralism and Media Freedom in the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies and the European University Center for Human Rights and Democratization, and she previously worked in the legal department of the International Secretariat of Amnesty International and in the office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and she holds a PhD in Public International Law from the EUI and master degree in Political Sociology from the London School of Economics and Political Science. And the floor is yours, dear Lisa. And you have 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the kind invitation to speak at this event. I'm very sorry to not be with you in person today. So my intervention will focus mainly on the topic of disinformation, in relation to some of the issues that have already been covered, in particular in relation to the issue of transparency. This is the risk of going after such great panelists on both panels, but I will reconnect a bit to the previous panel. But in particular, I'd like to look at this topic in relation to disinformation, as this is the main focus of the European Digital Media Observatory, EDMO, where I work. Just a couple of words about EDMO. EDMO is a platform bringing together stakeholders to combat disinformation in the EU. And its main approach is grounded in the idea that any long-term solution to disinformation requires building societal resilience against disinformation by strengthening the ability of society to better understand and discern disinformation, strengthening quality journalism, media literacy, fact-checking, and research. So in the context of the fight against disinformation, AI has become, of course, an increasingly important topic in the EU, including in the regulatory sphere, as we've just heard from our previous speaker, but also in the context of the Digital Services Act and the Code of Practice on Online Disinformation. So, in particular, I'd like to address 3 areas in relation to algorithmic design and disinformation, and their implications for human rights. So the first is in relation to algorithmic design of online platforms and their role in giving prominence to disinformation. This, of course, we've heard a lot about already in the previous panel. There are numerous studies which raise questions about the human rights implications of harmful algorithmic design. We've heard also from Sarah Egan about this. And of course, one of the widespread criticisms of online platforms has been precisely in relation to the expectation that engagement-focused ranking systems will amplify harmful content, including disinformation. So this has, of course, a number of implications in relation to human rights, including, for instance, what we saw in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic for the right to health, the right to free and fair elections, but also the right to information more generally. And as we know well, large social media platforms are very secretive about their algorithms, reveal very little about their inner workings, but increased transparency over algorithmic ranking systems, I would argue, is one of the urgent areas where we need more transparency. What is the organizing principle of these algorithms? What are they optimizing for? Is it engagement? Is it time spent on a surface? Is it content quality? Is it clicks? Is it something else? What does each algorithm in the interlocking set optimize for, and what is the system as a whole optimizing for? So this is the first area where transparency is urgently needed. The second area is closely linked, but has to do with algorithmic content moderation. So social media companies have been increasingly using complex algorithms and automated systems to rid their platforms of disinformation and other harmful content. The newly released transparency reports under the Digital Services Act give us a bit of a sense of the scale of this. So, for instance, on Instagram, 98.4% of the 76.3 million pieces of content that were removed from April 25 to September 30 this year were done so via automation. So, as it was reported also by Politico a few days ago, it becomes obvious from these numbers that in a few years, these levels of AI-aided content moderation will become ever more sophisticated and will perhaps in the end up replacing many of the people working on this content moderation, which may or not be a good thing, also based on what we heard from our previous speaker, given the conditions of some of this job. But it also gives more power to this black box AI systems where human moderation does not play a part in this. And there doesn't seem to be much depth in the reports of how this works and There's an urgent need here too to understand more about also the human rights implications and risks. As we heard also from our first panelist, are clear in the context of content moderation, especially in regard to the principle of freedom of expression. So while strong content moderation may be desirable in certain contexts, in others, especially with more fragile civil society and freedom of expression, media may be highly problematic and dangerous. So while there are some requirements under recent EU legislative instruments surrounding disinformation and illegal content, the reporting by platforms still remains somewhat limited. So for instance, the strengthened code of practice on online disinformation, which is an EU self-regulatory instrument, so which the main online platforms and many others have signed up to, and was adopted in its strengthened form in 2022, has a number of commitments, including the commitment that signatories will report on their policies and actions to ensure that the algorithms used for detection, moderation, and sanctioning of impermissible conduct and content on their services are trustworthy, respect the rights of end users, and do not constitute prohibited manipulative practices. So, of course, there is a concern for how this is done and transparency around this and the human rights implications, also in the Digital Services Act. But when we look at the first reports concerning content moderation, the transparency remains quite limited. Although platforms are reporting on the content moderated, it doesn't really give us a full picture of how decisions are made and how this relates to the broader online information environment. So these are two areas. The third area I wanted to address in relation to disinformation is the growing anxiety about the effects of AI, and in particular the new wave of generative AI on spreading disinformation. We've also heard a bit about this. Of course, the opportunities are abundant for producing content at large scale, which is auto-generated, inauthentic, and false. So the risks for disinformation are huge. And here too, transparency appears to be a central issue in which there's an urgent need, not only for transparency to better understand the disinformation flows, but also to adequately inform the policy responses. But also, in order to develop effective tools to counter such disinformation, for instance, through automated fact-checking tools, there is an urgent need for access to platform data to be able to understand and develop tools for automated detection of disinformation. So here too, it's important to recognize that there are both promises and perils of AI in this context, and it may be a double-edged sword. We see that disinformation spreaders and those that are trying to tackle disinformation are often caught in this endless cat and mouse chase, trying to catch up on increasingly using advanced AI technologies. So in general, very much in line with the previous panel, I would argue that the issue that is most pressing in this context in Europe, but I would say also globally, is the question of transparency and the policy responses that are being developed, perhaps with little understanding of the information environment as a whole and how policies may affect it. So in this context, Europe is making some significant progress in pushing for transparency from large platforms, as we heard also from the first panel. And research and civil society access to data about social media platforms has become perhaps one of the primary way policymakers, the public and advertisers can gain an increased understanding of the information environment. So the European policy response has increasingly recognized the fundamental role to be played by independent scientific research in this field. And as many of you probably know, the regulatory instruments themselves include a number of provisions allowing or trying to enable access to data for research purposes. So the strengthened code of practice on this information, which I mentioned, includes a provision on access to continuous real-time or near real-time searchable, stable access to non-personal data, and anonymized, aggregated, or manifestly made public data for research purposes through automated means such as APIs. And the DSA contains a similar provision. And as some of you may know, this is distinguished in two parts in Article 40 of the DSA, addressing on one hand the more private, sensitive data, which raises concerns under GDPR, but also the more public data. So providers of very large platforms are expected to give access without undue delay to data, including where technically possible, to real-time data, provided that the data is publicly accessible. So public data should be made accessible by platforms, according to recent EU legislation, including the Digital Services Act. So these are two key areas in regulation. In relation to this, many platforms have started to set up mechanisms to allow real-time access to data for researchers. Now, this is an important area. Why? Researchers can play multiple roles here. They can play a key role to, of course, understand the spread of this information, but they are also called in to assess the role performed by platform in content prioritization and moderation, auditing algorithms, understanding the implications of online content moderation practices and the implementation. But also, some have argued that actually they may even be called in to assess the transparency efforts under the legal instruments themselves, like the DSA. Some argue that researchers may become the new auditors. Of course, they shouldn't be, but they can provide an independent check, not only on the platform self-assessment, but also on the independent audits themselves. So many different roles to be played by independent research in the area of transparency. And as we've seen, many platforms have started to provide or to create, some faster than others, new APIs to allow access to data for research purposes. Perhaps with the most notable exception of Twitter X, which actually started charging researchers for access to data and has since left the code of practice. But the other main online platforms have started either revamping or developing new APIs for researchers to fulfill these requirements. So a number of questions remain here, which I think are relevant to the panel, but also to the audience in the room, perhaps. First of all, will these systems be sufficient to allow meaningful insight to researchers in terms of the types of data they provide? Will they shed light also into questions of algorithmic design, content moderation, and their impact on human rights? Will they be built fast enough to cope with the new wave of generative AI and allow counter tools to be built in time in this race with many important elections coming up in 2024? Will the programs and tools developed be opened up beyond academic research to allow also access to other stakeholders like civil society, fact checkers, and potentially even journalists? And finally, perhaps most interesting for this audience is also related to the questions of the previous panelists. Will the tools built in response to the EU legal instruments also expand to include researchers and data from social media users outside Europe? So will there be an expansion of these tools beyond Europe, or will there be some kind of impact of EU regulation on platform transparency, which will have a meaningful effect beyond Europe? So I think my time is up, but I'm happy to talk about this more in the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And now we are continuing with the questions. And I think the questions can be in Turkish and English. We can translate it. I have two questions for the panelists, but we can continue my questions. Okay, thank you so much. Well, first of all, with Shumaila, we know that many steps have been taken to regulate AI systems in the world, from the US, the European Union, and we know that Biden has just signed an executive order addressing AI, and European Union discusses the draft AI Act. And also we know that these rules, binding or non-binding rules, address the principles like transparency, equality, non-discrimination, safety. And I just wonder, how do you evaluate the challenges to implement these principles into regulations? Binding rules or non-binding rules, not important. What's the challenges according to you?
I think that it's an important conversation to have, because sometimes sort of the blunt instrument of the law, as especially when it comes to speech and content aspects, having any kind of regulation runs into a kind of free speech issue, which is very important. I think I have yet to see a very, very good regulation on content moderation, and content moderation also with relation to automated content moderation, that can truly account for the complex ways in which speech occurs, and also sort of the global nature of it, in which it becomes very, very diverse, in which it becomes much more contextual. So I think somebody in the a question in the last panel was, we have agreed to a certain extent that violent content should not be allowed on these platforms, but when it comes to sort of witnessing violence or human rights violations, then it comes in. So it's so complex and sort of case to case. So I think regulation in terms of design, and regulation that allows for that is binding, that allows for transparency, I think is the way to go, rather than getting at directly to the speech. If we look at the system and how to improve that kind of system through binding mechanisms, I think that's the best way to go about it, because I think other attempts at regulating speech are very clumsy a lot of the time. And I do agree with Lisa as well, like sort of transparency is perhaps most important, because that is what the way that tech companies operate, there's a lot of obfuscation, both in terms of their design, how it is implemented, and also when those harms occur, there's also this kind of entire machinery that comes into play in order to disprove whether that really happened, and to effectively gaslight people who have been researching and documenting on it. So I think for them to open up as much as possible, and I think for that we need binding rules, just because these companies are not going to do it voluntarily. The kind of power that they hold, and the people trying to hold them accountable, there's such a big power differential that I think it has to be some kind of binding way, and how that gets implemented, I think, is the real question. Then, where do we get that? Is it the US, where most of these companies are, or the EU, which holds a lot of economic power, so companies might listen to it? That is, I think, how do we go about it is probably the more complex question. And I think, just reiterating that, we don't want to create also these kind of like different kinds of a sort of hierarchy of regulation where like certain populations enjoy more. So I think getting at like sort of when we build these binding transparency mechanisms, it's very, very important to make sure that it's something that is sort of gets at the design of how everything happens and sort of obligates these companies to do it across the board, and to create, because I think trying to create economic incentives, trying to create other kinds of incentives is not really working, because it's just they've become so powerful. I think maybe early interventions might have been better, but the kind of like beast that we've created, I think it has to be binding. But if for directly regulating speech, I wouldn't probably be in favor of that. That's an entirely different discussion, because it has a lot of complex, sort of contextual issues, a lot going on. And I think sort of speech regulation at scale is very, like, I wouldn't trust these companies with it.
Thank you so much. My last question is to Lisa. We face hate speech on social media, and there is no exact definition of hate speech. And my question is, do you think what are possible ways to identify disinformation and harmful content on social media, and what are the possible or current problems for the social media users about this issue?
Okay, thank you. So this is a complex question with many different elements to it, but I will give it a go. So just to say that, as I mentioned at EDMO, we look at this information, but what we've seen increasingly is, well, when we started off, there was this clear distinction between kind of what is legal and what is illegal. And this information was seen to often fall in the legal category, in the sense that it was everything that was not illegal, but still harmful. So done with an intent to harm and so on, but was in this more legal category. The distinction is not always so clear, and often hate speech and disinformation go together. So it's not often there are instances where disinformation is also illegal. So of course, these categories are very difficult to separate and keep apart. Often disinformation goes with a series of other illegal behaviors. So having said that, we have a clear definition of disinformation, which is that the intent to spread this with the element of intent, which distinguishes it from misinformation. But at the same time, especially with a number of events, but also in the context of the war in Ukraine and more recent events, we see that, I mean, it's very difficult to separate the grounds in all of this. Having said that, it doesn't really matter from a certain point of view, in the sense that the approach that you're mentioning is how to equip the user to distinguish and so on. Of course, there's the content moderation side, which would be activated in case of illegal behavior, especially now with the DSA coming into place in the EU. But with respect to the question of how to equip users to distinguish, I guess, disinformation and also hate speech, we have this approach, which I think is also reflected in the code of practice on disinformation, that there are many different avenues and different parts of society need to be empowered in different ways. And one of the key areas of EDMO activity is media literacy, so trying to educate towards being able to either discern disinformation or educate in schools, or kind of have this critical approach. Of course, there are risks here with the dangers of undermining trust in reliable media. So there has to be this fine line between pushing for critical approaches, but at the same time not undermining trust in media, trust in society as a whole, trust in news. So in this sense, how possible ways to help society identify disinformation, definitely this. EDMO has a network of fact checkers who operate across Europe and share information on their fact checking content. This is normally the case when it is not illegal behavior. This would be a label, of course. that then would be featured on next to the story or simply on the fact checker's webpage, but trying to give a context to the disinformation story, why it was fact checked and so on. So to kind of provide information to the public to be able to make their own judgment on whether something is true or false. Aside from this, we always push for increased research to try and understand how disinformation spreads, what are its avenues, what kind of policy responses may be useful, and so on. I hope this answers your question that was more about the user, but I'm not sure if I captured it in relation to the hate speech dimension.
So much for your great answer. And continue in Turkish for the translation to Lisa and other participants. Pardon.
One point that most people are curious of is the legal dimension of it. In the previous panel, we've talked about the technical aspects, but in the second panel, we touched upon legal dimensions and aspects of it. And I wonder if you have any questions about it. And Mr. Gökhan, Professor Gökhan, I am representing him, and maybe I could address the questions that are mostly posed to him.
About these legal issues, please. Yeah.
So thank you for your talks. Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of insight on how to create a regulatory framework and how we counter hate speech and disinformation. But maybe this is me being a bit cynical and I guess a bit of an activist. I'm really worried about the enforcement side of this, because oftentimes we often see, reports in the media or, on social media, Meta was fined this much for breaking this rule, or now X was fined this much for breaking that rule. But it's often a very, very tiny fraction of the profits they make from spreading this much hate and this much disinformation. So I know this is a bit off topic and this a bit of a stretch, but I'm wondering, especially in the light of the coming European elections, what can the EU do about this, and maybe what can the rest of the world do about this, the enforcement side? Because I guess we need to hit them in the pocket, but that's not really happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you want, we can begin with you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question. I think, but again, regulation, sort of what I also mentioned was, and I truly think this is something that we need to talk more about, is that regulation operates within this kind of economic model where we have accepted that these companies have the power that they have amassed and the kind of exploitation models that they have built this power on should be kept intact, and we just need to sort of the rough edges need to be smooth, and then everything will be okay. Fundamentally, I think regulation needs to grapple with the sheer power of these companies, and I think that's something that perhaps this kind of regulation isn't equipped to do. There are conversations, for example, in the US about sort of just breaking up some of these companies. Should they be able to acquire other platforms? Should they be able to completely have a stronghold over the information landscape should 3 companies just be dictating, 3 or 4 companies be dictating the kind of content that we consume. I think that's a very important conversation. Perhaps, I don't know if that's what your question was addressing, but I think the current regulation isn't equipped to do that, and that would require a larger conversation. And I think even when we talk about, like, for example, data protection, it doesn't get at the exploitation, that is sort of the ways in which data is being profited off. It's again sort of just trying to operate within that kind of larger capitalist model. So I think questioning that is perhaps the most important. We'll keep trying to sort of to play this kind of game. Now disinformation is a problem, let's have regulation for that. When that doesn't get fixed, there'll be like another trend, and then we'll just be doing that and without really addressing how these companies have acquired so much power and why we have allowed them to acquire so much power and thus so much influence. So I think I definitely think that that is the way to go, and to fundamentally then also be okay with imagining a very different kind of internet where there wouldn't be these kind of centralized platforms is important. But yeah, I don't see that in any of these regulatory discussions. I don't know if Lisa wants to come.
Thank you so much. And lastly, dear Lisa, would you like to add some things about it?
Sure, maybe just to say that at least in the EU, I guess we're all watching to see what will happen, because the DSA, so the Digital Services Act, which is of course brand new and hasn't been really applied yet, but it does have this promise that it can apply fines up to 6% of the worldwide annual turnover of the platform. So this is a significant fine if this was to happen. But of course, it remains to be seen in cases of breaches of the DSA obligations. But this is all new. So I would say we don't really know how this will work in practice and what kind of breaches and how this will be applied. So I guess we're all waiting curiously to see, as of course there are already instances of problematic cases. For instance, the case of Twitter X that already left the code of practice, which, although it is a self-regulatory instrument, can become a co-regulatory instrument in the context of the DSA. So I guess my short answer would be let's see if anything is changing with the DSA, because that's the hope in Europe, that it will have more enforcement power.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer. And personally, I just can say that for Turkey, the problem is that we don't respect the rule of law. We have rules, we have regulations, but we don't want to apply for them, or we just don't want to use them. The main problem is we don't respect the rule of law. And yes, in the end, I thank the Hrant Dink Foundation for this great organization, and dear panelists, Shumayla and Lisa and Gökhan Ahi, and this great participants. And I hope we can meet each other in other organizations. Thank you so much.